Hiya, this is part 2 on a series of videos I'm doing about Vance Packards' book The People Shapers, and I'm connecting this to a series of videos I did on Julian Huxley's Essays in Popular Science and Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World. If you haven't seen them, you can find them on YouTube, hopefully. And I was just getting into the introduction. I just want to say, this book was written in 1978. Quite a while ago, really, and I think it was, like A Brave New World and Essays in Popular Science, it was just getting people used to the idea of the inventions and technologies that were going to be round the corner, maybe that weren't invented but were nearly invented, or the inventions that had already been discovered, but were just waiting to be introduced to the general population. Because I do believe that. As I said, I've looked at what you would call occult researchers, and there's many out there, but there's a really good one called Alan Watt, and he says that the elite are far more advanced than we are told, and so they already have these inventions, but they're getting us. They slowly kind of program us to get us used to the idea, because if they kind of shoved it in front of our faces, we may never trust them. So it's a slow kind of indoctrination, kind of a slow drip towards this, totalitarian Brave New World. And this book was probably could have been, well, I think. He's certainly got the ideas out there, and I don't know. I mean, I think Vance Packard seemed to have good intentions. He was trying to get the message out, but I have a feeling this book really put it into the it got the idea into the minds of the masses, because it's the Evening News and the Daily Mirror and the Guardian were quoting it back in the 70s. So. But a good book nonetheless. It probably shocked and scared people, much like a Brave New World would have shocked and scared people. And I guess, like I said, it's a good way of putting it out there, just like in science fiction. Shocks and scares people, but it conditions them, gets them used to the idea. As Alan Watts said, he heard him on the radio, he said this is an intergenerational battle that's going on, and it was going on then in the 70s, and it's definitely going on now, as far as I'm concerned. So just let's read the introduction, and if I can, I'm going to not deliberately skip, but I don't want to linger and kind of over focus on something. I really want to kind of want this to flow if I can, because I don't want to kind of waffle on too much on a specific subject. But in the introduction, it says here, this book suggests that we are racing towards the hair-raising world envisioned by two Englishmen. I refer, of course, to George Orwell's brutish, all-seeing dictatorship of 1984, and the more distant, far more sophisticated dictatorship of Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World, which is human hatcheries, personality moulding, and enticing use of drugs. With its human hatcheries, personality moulding, enticing use of drugs. The People Shapers is about current factual developments worldwide. It is not confined to the strategies of human engineers in America or the Soviet Union. British scientists and technologists are in the forefront in pioneering a number of the new techniques for reshaping man. This is true, for example, in applications to modify our biological makeup. It was primarily Britons who broke the genetic code, and it is Britons who are far advanced in test tube creation of humans, in pre-sexing babies, in transplanting embryos, in freezing embryos, in cell fusion, in greatly extending human lifespan. The first cloning to create worldwide attention was done in Oxford University. That doesn't make me think of the Huxley brothers. They were English, and I'm sure. I think it was, yeah. They studied in Oxford University, so connections there. I think. Just as the Industrial Revolution was especially British, so too is today's biological revolution. Historian Donald Fleming says that the current biological revolution is likely to be as decisive for the history of the next 150 years as the Industrial Revolution has been for the period since the 1750s. A number of the innovations of manipulating behaviour, however, have been up to now particularly American. These are described in the early part of this book. I referred to attempts of behaviour modification by conditioning techniques, using drugs to pacify school children and prisoners, using electricity to modify our moods and personality, use of surgery to alter personality, use of hidden TV cameras and vast computers to maintain surveillance of the populace, use of subliminal stimulation to sell products, use of drugs to modify intelligence, and on it goes. And that was by Vance Packards in 1977, and it's just more relevant now, isn't it? That's kind of one of the reasons why I'm talking about this book. It's so much more relevant now, and yet it was being spoke of in the 70s. Interesting. Mentions Skinner and Pavlov. Let's have a brief look on my notes. Very briefly, I made on Skinner. I'm not going to go into it. If I can find them somewhere. Bear with me. Here we are. Yeah, if you've never heard of Skinner, I think you studied him in school. Most people did if you're in England anyway. Fields psychology, linguistics and philosophy. Are known for apparent conditioning, radical behaviourism, influenced by Charles Darwin and Ivan Pavlov. Skinner considered free will as an illusion and human action dependent on consequences of previous actions. If the consequences are bad, there is a high chance the action will not be repeated. If the consequences are good, the actions that led to it being repeated become more probable. So, yeah, he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't really believe that there was an internal process in a person. He believed everything was external. So that really kind of dehumanises in itself. So, and I think, Ivan Pavlov, he was a physiologist, physician, known for classic conditioning and behavioural modification. I think he was very similar, and his teaching is kind of mentioned in A Brave New World, isn't it? When they're conditioning children not to like the country, when they're looking at, I think it's a picture of some nice flowers or some greenery, and then they receive an electric shock, I think, when they see that, and so they associate that with negativity. So they bring preconditioned as babies. So there's a connection there, mind control, isn't there? So that's enough of Skinner and Pavlov, I think. I don't want to linger too far, but yeah, it says here, Packard's reading, many of the some of the projects to shape or control man are simply intriguing. Many are disturbing. Some may make your skin crawl. By the latter I mean such plans as keeping people under surveillance by locking transmitters in their bodies, creating subhumans for mental work, and as a source of spare parts for human bodies, transplanting heads, creating humans with 4 or more parents, and that's interesting, I read about that, and pacifying troublesome people, including children, by cutting into the brain. The strategies being pressed by the human engineers have caused some observers to suggest that we are hurtling towards the fictional worlds envisioned by 2 Englishmen. I refer to George Orwell, 1984, and Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, projected for 6 centuries from now. Actually, Orwell's big brother was pretty heavy-handed and simplistic compared with Huxley's world controller, Mustafa Mond. I mentioned him, I think, in the previous videos I did. Mustafa Mond. Orwell, writing in the period of Stalin and Hitler primarily extrapolated totalitarian policing techniques. His big brother controlled by intrusion, such as installing a watching TV eye in every home, and by setting up thought police. He ruled by exquisite forms of coercion and by massive indoctrination. Huxley's controller, conceived earlier in 1932, developed his controls by far more sophisticated scientific techniques. His controller saw that total control should start at conception. In hatcheries made possible by reproductive biology, embryos were moulded in order to order by genetic means to become humans of certain types. Their level of intelligence was controlled in part by them manipulating the amount of oxygen given to the fetuses, and we spoke of that. Future sewer workers who needed few brains were mass-produced on low levels of oxygen. Once new humans were born, a variety of controls continued from infancy on. Persons were induced to love their assigned status and the regime by the use of neo-Pavlovian conditioning, as we said, techniques, by sleep teaching, we mentioned that, and by a wondrous soma drug. There is no single soma drug as such today, but the states it produces, tranquility, stimulation, colourful visions, and apparently high suggestibility, all can now be produced by specific drugs of precise techniques. So they're saying that it's a real possibility. Most of the techniques Huxley fantasized for the distant future are already becoming available, or at least being forecast by reputable scientists. One of them is sleep teaching. Modern experiments have shown that a person can learn messages whispered in his ear as he's falling asleep. Huxley, erroneously as it turned out, had the person deeply asleep when learning from the whispered message, but his idea was valid in the main. Today there is no all-powerful controller in sight in the Western world. I'm not sure about that, but anyway. The coming crunch on natural resources, combined with rampant overbreeding in many areas of the world, make it likely that we will be hearing calls from more authoritarian governments within the coming quarter century. At any rate, there are already a host of technologies in various fields who qualify as people controllers or people shapers. They are becoming, willingly or not, a new elite. Many work for institutions, including governments, to help those institutions increase their power to control us and to impose their values and views on others. Meanwhile, the ordinary person's sense of power over his life is threatened. And it says here, a few pages later, actually we're running short on time, so that's part 2. Let's continue in part 3.